I'd like to call the meeting to order. If I could have your attention. My name's Ty Emmett. I'm the wildlife officer here in Fayette County. I'd like to thank everyone for coming out. Also, I'd like to say a special thanks to Fayette Academy for being gracious for us, letting us use their gymnasium for this public meeting. Appreciative of that. I know lots of you have several thoughts and concerns about CWD. We understand that. If you have any questions, there'll be people walking around during the meeting, and you can give those questions, write them down on a little index card, and we'll take them over here at this table, and at the end of the meeting, we'll be answering those for you. So at this time, I would like to introduce to you TWRA's Chief of Wildlife. That's Joe Benedict, and he'll be our facilitator of the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Ty, and good evening, everyone. I feel like I'm a short guy here. Can y'all see me? So welcome. Thank you for coming out tonight. I'm Joe Benedict, Chief of Wildlife. We're here tonight, as you know, to continue our discussion about chronic wasting disease. And we're here to have that discussion, continue that discussion with our most important partners, who are hunters, landowners, processors, and taxidermists. You guys and gals, men and women, are the most critical partner that we have in our fight against chronic wasting disease. So thank you for coming tonight. The last time we were together, we shared the gut-wrenching and shock of finding chronic wasting disease in our deer herd here in Tennessee. And so the emotions that you felt as hunters and landowners are the same that I felt as a hunter, as a venison consumer, and most of our agency folks who either hunt or have friends that give them venison. So these emotions that we shared together with you all. I think we've gotten past that initial shock. Chronic wasting disease is still very, very new to us here in Tennessee. We're past that shock, initial shock, and I want to thank you for engaging with us and for partnering with us and for trusting us in the early days of our response to chronic wasting disease last fall and throughout the winter. And I don't want to steal any thunder from our presenters tonight, but part of the reason we're here tonight is to celebrate what you all have helped us achieve. You know, the samples that you provided in your hunting, you guys continued to hunt after we detected chronic wasting disease. You drove to mandatory check stations, you know, obviously out of the way from your house or a processor. Many of you drove to a freezer location to provide a sample to us, and we want to thank you for that. And the celebration tonight of, it's not celebrating chronic wasting disease, but we're celebrating our partnership and your part in what we're going to share tonight as far as what we've learned about chronic wasting disease in Tennessee. I want to share one statistic with you because many of you did drive out of your way. You might have wondered, boy, I wonder how many other hunters are going to these mandatory check stations. I wonder how many hunters are dropping their heads off in these freezers. And I want to say that most of the hunters, the majority of hunters that harvested deer during those weekends went to those check stations. The first weekend, it was about 70%. But the last weekend, that fifth weekend, about 100% of people that checked in a deer did that at a mandatory check station. So kudos to you guys. I know many of you have done that. You, like I said, you probably wondered if other hunters were participating. So we're very thankful for you as partners and proud of how you guys turned out to help us. And tonight we're going to build on the actions that you guys took last fall throughout the extended season by sharing samples with us. We're going to build on that and share with you what we know about chronic wasting disease in Tennessee. And I just want to mention to folks, say hello to those folks that are viewing us live on Facebook. Last meeting that we had around 2,000 people, I think, that were joining us online. So welcome to those folks that are here on the internet. And then we had 30 or 40,000 people view that video afterwards. So you guys are here, and we appreciate you being here. There's other people that are here with us that we can't see. So tonight we're going to hear from three speakers. Dr. Dan Grove, who spoke with us last time, will share some general information on chronic wasting disease. Again, this is still a new disease in Tennessee, and we want to make sure that we all have the same basic understanding of the disease and how it acts. Second, Chuck Yost will share what we've learned from the samples that you provided. It's cutting in and out. Okay. We will share what we've learned about chronic wasting disease in Tennessee throughout these 3 counties and then the surrounding counties from the samples you submitted. And then we'll hear from James Kelly about some initial thoughts I'll just pause there. These are initial thoughts about what the hunting season will look like. I imagine probably everyone in this room really might be here for that reason in particular. What is going to happen in the fall? So we'll share some initial thoughts about that. I also want to mention that after we gather input from you, we're going to have a survey that we'll talk about in a few minutes for those that are viewing live, and for you here in the room after the meeting, you can go to that survey. Also wanted to mention that in April, we have a commission meeting, and we're going to present a better polished version of these concepts that James is going to share. We'll present that to the commission, so we invite you to come to that meeting. After the meeting, we'll take public comments for a few weeks, and then in May, the commission will vote on the final hunting regulations for the CWD positive and high-risk counties. So we're going to share tonight just kind of some concepts, where we think we're going, and some rationale as to why, and then get your input later on today, followed up with 2 commission meetings. So you'll have lots of other chances for input. And then we'll end the evening with a question and answer session similar to we did last meeting. And so Ty did a good job of reminding us about the cards. If you guys need some cards and want to provide comments, wave your hands. We've got some staff. Roger's there. If anybody needs a card, just make sure you let us know. So with that, I'll invite Dr. Dan Grove to the microphone. Dr. Grove works for the University of Tennessee Extension as a wildlife health specialist and a wildlife veterinarian. TWRA and UT have partnered to bring Dr. Grove to Tennessee. He's actually from Tennessee. He's a native here. He spent some time working in Wisconsin, another CWD positive state, Michigan, and North Dakota, where he found, I guess he was there when they discovered chronic wasting disease. So he's got a lot of firsthand experience battling chronic wasting disease, and he's been an invaluable partner to us in this response. And so he's going to share, again, information, just kind of the basics about chronic wasting disease. So join me in welcoming Dr. Grove.
Get that ready. Thanks, Joe. Appreciate the introduction there. Again, just to kind of reiterate, I'm with the University of Tennessee Extension, and I serve as the wildlife health specialist for the state. Primarily what I want to do is just kind of give you a little bit of background information on chronic wasting disease, because no matter how many times we talk about it, there's always some little caveat that a lot of people haven't heard about. And so we'll kind of go through it, and hopefully a lot of this is actually a review, because for a lot of you in the room, if not, hopefully you'll learn something tonight. So what I'm going to cover is basically the who, what, where, when, why, and how of chronic wasting disease, and what we've learned about the disease in the rest of the United States. And I'll reserve what we've actually learned here in Tennessee for the other speakers tonight. So chronic wasting disease is actually what's called a TSE. And what that is it's the causative agent is actually a prion, and that's just a misfolded infectious protein. It doesn't act like a bacteria or a virus or a parasite or a fungus. It's its own class of organism. There's several other known diseases that are in this that you might have heard of. One would be BSE, which is mad cow disease. Another one in sheep and goats would be scrapie. And the human form of the disease is called CJD, or Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. If you look kind of in this picture right here, the bright red areas are actually the prion protein that's had a special stain applied to it. And this deer was actually a deer that was from West Virginia that Squid has provided us with the picture of this animal. So in the United States, our susceptible species are going to be our cervid species. So that's going to be our big game species. So our white-tailed deer and elk in the state of Tennessee. Out west, there's also been mule deer and moose that have been naturally infected. Black-tailed deer have been experimentally infected as well as in captivity. Caribou in Norway, Finland, and Sweden, they've had both caribou and moose that have been seen to be infected. And muntjac have actually been artificially infected in a laboratory setting. The map kind of gives you an idea of where the distribution of the disease is at this point in time in the United States. It is not known to actually be infectious to cattle, sheep, horses, or goats. Experimentally, it has been shown to be actually infectious to pigs. The disease is pretty much, the prion protein itself can be found mostly anywhere you look in the body. The heaviest locations where the prion is actually found, the highest concentrations, are going to be in your brain, your spinal cord, and your lymph nodes. And those are the primary tissues that we look at whenever we're taking samples at these check stations. We're primarily looking at lymph nodes, but if we can, we will also get spinal cord, which would be the obex. And so, yeah, it's been found in saliva, urine, feces, and blood. And so if you can pretty much imagine anywhere the blood goes in the body, the prion can be distributed as a result of the blood going there. In terms of the mechanisms of spread, so how does an animal actually get the disease? The way it's transmitted is the presumed oral route. So basically the animal has to at some point in time come in contact with the prion and actually ingest that prion is the most likely means of infection. There have been some studies in certain species that have actually shown that it can cross over to the fawn in utero. So basically whenever it's during gestation in the womb, it can actually cross over. The environment as the disease progresses in a given population becomes more of an important role. Areas where animals will naturally congregate or artificially congregate on a landscape, such as bait sites, feed sites, rubs and scrapes, mineral licks, whether those are natural mineral licks or artificial mineral licks. Those are all places where the prion can tend to accumulate. Again, remember, it's just shed in pretty much every excretion that comes out of that animal, so any place where you're concentrating animals on a landscape, you're concentrating the prion. Unfortunately, at this point in time, there's no really easy way to destroy the prion. Your normal mechanisms, like if a bacteria got into the environment of sunlight, heat, even cold, freezing, any, dry or wet conditions, they'll destroy a lot of other organisms. Prions are not destroyed by anything naturally in the environment. Prions themselves can only be destroyed by high heat, and when we say that, we're talking over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit incineration to actually destroy the prion to where it's no longer infectious, or through chemical denaturing. So, we use a 50% bleach solution to actually destroy the prion on the instruments and things that we use. And your normal household bleach might be 1 to 10%. So once it gets in the environment, that is a huge potential source of reinfection or infection of animals once it's out there. And some of the studies have shown up to 15 years that the disease can exist and persist in the environment and still remain infectious. And there's certain soil types that actually, when the prions bind it, they become more infectious. Most things, when it gets in the environment, it becomes less infectious, but prions can potentially become more infectious depending on where they're at. So what are we looking to see? The reality is most of the infected animals out there, you're not going to recognize that they're actually infected because it takes so long before you actually see those clinical signs. And then shortly after you see those clinical signs, within a couple of months, they're usually going to pass away. So it takes about 10 to 18 months on average from the point of infection to the point where that animal actually becomes clinical, as we call it, and you can see signs outwardly. So they would have a thin, poor hair coat, kind of like this animal. It's in the late stages of the disease. They may be seen just standing there drooling or stumbling. They could be walking in circles. You might see them laying down and urinating and defecating on themselves. Or they would just appear blind and very approachable. Now keep in mind, I can give you about 10 to 15 other diseases that will cause all of these same clinical signs. The only way we're actually going to know that it is chronic wasting disease causing that is to get a sample out of that animal. The way surveillance is generally done in most states, we're looking at targeted surveillance year-round, and so that's those animals that we just talked about that are showing those clinical signs. We look at those animals more closely and try to get samples out of them and remove them from the landscape. We'll look at animals that are ADR, ain't doing right. They're just something wrong, they're just not quite right. They don't show all these same clinical signs, but a lot of times those are the animals that we want to look at because those are the animals that are actually infected. And we'll also look at roadkills. And then obviously, we've got the hunter-harvested surveillance program, and that's where we get the early stage infections. A lot of these animals, because when you harvest an animal, generally you're harvesting an animal that looks healthy to you, right? So it's not showing those clinical signs, and that's really when we want to detect the disease, is before they've been on the landscape for that 10 to 18 months or even potentially longer. In terms of the tests that we do, there's a couple of different chemical tests that we use, and we send them off to Colorado State University at this point in time to get those tests done. In terms of treatment, there's no known treatment. The disease is 100% fatal if the animal becomes infected with it. And that goes actually for any prion disease. Of all the prion diseases that have been looked at, there's not been actually good not diagnostic tool, but a good treatment available to stop the disease once it's actually recognized as being the cause, as a prion. In terms of resistance, there is about 5% of the general population of most deer and elk that will express what's called resistance genes. Resistance does not equate to immunity. Resistance just means the animals get infected and it takes longer to actually show those clinical signs that we discussed. So that 10 to 18 month period might actually be 18 to 36 months or even longer depending on the species. And that's actually not necessarily a good thing because that animal is then actually on the landscape for that much longer and they're shedding prions during that whole time period and leading to more environmental contamination as a result of the disease. In terms of prevention, there's been a lot of studies looking at vaccination. Most of them basically have proven they either don't work. There was one vaccine study that actually made the animals more susceptible to getting infected with the disease, which is kind of the opposite of what you want. And then other ones, it took 8 doses of a certain vaccine given every month, and that's just not practical for wildlife. So the big one, and the big question that we spend a lot of time talking about and discussing is it zoonotic? Meaning, can you get that? If you eat meat from infected animal or if you're handling these animals, can you get the disease? The reality is, we don't know. There's been conflicting studies using animal models to kind of represent what would happen in people. And there's been some studies that show that yes, it can, and some studies that show it can't. As an agency, and in my position, we don't make recommendations for human health protocols, so we defer to the CDC for our recommendations and when it comes to this. Basically, and I'll get to this in the next slide too, but if you're hunting and harvesting an animal in an area that's known to have CWD, the recommendation is to get that tested if you're concerned. And if it tests positive, do not consume meat from that animal because we can't tell you that you're not going to get sick from it. But keep in mind, the disease has been on the landscape for about 50 to 60 years out west. And in the upper Midwest, it's been for 20 plus years. And there's been a lot of people eat infected meat, and there's not been a proven link between eating infected meat and actually developing disease in people. But since there's potentially numerous variants out there, the studies look at just a handful of those variants. And we don't know if that prion might actually mutate over time, which happens with a lot of our other infectious agents like bacteria and viruses. So based on that information and the just uncertainty behind it is why we go with the CDC recommendations. Again, just to emphasize, if you're hunting or harvesting animals in an area that's known to have the disease, we highly recommend you get tested if you're concerned. And if it tests positive, we don't recommend that you consume the meat from that animal. So just quickly, I want to, before I get to the end, I just want to go through and show you kind of how the disease has spread across the United States over the last, basically the disease was first identified in the late 60s in northern Colorado and southern Wyoming, kind of on the Colorado-Wyoming border. How the disease has just kind of spread throughout the United States and just the progression to kind of get us where we're at today and lead into where we're sitting at with the disease in Tennessee. So this is the known distribution of the disease in gray on this map. In terms of the dots, those are actually captive cervid farms. The red ones still actively have animals in them, and the yellow ones have been depopulated. But the gray areas is what we're focusing on here in terms of where the counties have been found positive. So this is where we're at with 2004. We've more intensive scrutiny, looking closer, starting to find the disease in more places. It's spreading out from the initial area there in Colorado and Wyoming. In terms of 2012, this is where we're at. And then today, this is the current known distribution of the disease. It's in 26 states and 3 Canadian provinces. It's also in 4 foreign countries. Just this week, it was identified additionally in Finland. So it's in Finland, Sweden, this week it was identified in Sweden. But Finland, Sweden, Norway, and then it was transported to South Korea via the captive cervid industry. So what's the real world outcomes? What have other states seen that have had it for a lot longer time period? And just kind of what can we potentially expect if, 20, 30 years from now, if we don't get a hold of it, get ahead of the disease. They're starting to see a shift in age structure. There's less and less older animals on the landscape, and does may only have one fawn before succumbing to the disease. And often the fawns have a poor survival rate if they're born to a doe that has the disease because she doesn't survive long enough to actually raise that fawn and get it to where it can survive on its own. And there's been some areas where the population declines are upwards of 40%, and there's no sign of recovery in those areas. So I'm going to go back and just real quick, there's one other thing I want to point out. In terms of long-term with this disease, what we're looking at is if we make management decisions, we're not going to see changes right away. It takes a long time for the disease to progress on the landscape. So what we do this year, we might not see the impacts of that for 5 years. And that goes with any changes we make, whether it's habitat management or otherwise. The deer that are in the landscape today are here as a result of what we did 20 years ago to get them to this point. So when we're talking about managing this disease, that's the same kind of time scale that we're going to look at if we're actually going to try and do a good job of measuring it. It's going to be a 5 to 10 years minimum before we start to see changes as a result of any sort of management. With that in mind, I'm going to pass it off to our TWRA folks. You'll see this plenty of times tonight. This is where you can get more information on the disease, as well as keep up to date, connected with CWD email updates if you sign up on the TWRA website. With that, I'll pass it off. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Grove. Thank you, Dr. Grove. Our next speaker is Chuck Yost. Many of you may know him from his time in this area as a wildlife officer. He's currently our CWD coordinator for the agency, and he's going to talk about the results of the samples that you all provided and what that tells us about CWD in Tennessee today. Chuck?
Okay, good evening, everyone. It's good to see you all, and thank you to everyone who has joined us online. I'm extremely grateful for those who attended in person. Wasn't quite sure about attendance, so I'm glad to see that we have good attendance, and also thankful for the staff support that we have tonight. This has been such a monumental effort, and it's something that means a lot to me and to my colleagues, and I appreciate your all's support throughout this entire event. This evening, I want to share with you just very briefly how this all started, the management actions that the agency is taking, share with you the current status of CWD, and the reason that we know so much about CWD in Tennessee already is because of the partnership that we've had with all the affected stakeholders like yourself, and we want to continue that partnership. So there'll be a lot of emphasis on what we've learned, and then the invitation to continue partnering with us so that we can best manage this disease in our state. So quite a bit to share about how hunters can help, and then the next steps for TWRA. So you'll recall that back in December of 14 that chronic wasting disease became a reality in Tennessee. We became the 26th state. The first indication or the first detections of the disease occurred in Fayette and Hardeman counties, and the source and the timing of the introduction is unknown. One of the most common questions that I'm asked is, how long has CWD been in Tennessee? And the answer is, there's no way to know. There's no way to know how long it's been here. The only thing that I can say for certain is that it's been here for years, but there's no way to know beyond that. So those are some unknowns that are just unavoidable. And when folks struggle with that, and when I struggle with that, I just constantly remind myself that there's nothing that can be done about that anyway. And the best way to look at this is, what can we do now, and how can we best manage it? And that's where that's how I encourage others to think of this as well. So some immediate actions that the agency and the commission took in regards to the detection of CWD is carcass exportation restrictions for the 3 highlighted counties. And those counties were Fayette and Hardeman, where those initial detections came from. And then McNairy County was also impacted because CWD was found within 10 miles of there. You may have noticed that from the previous slide, and I'll show it one more time just to show that the dot or the circle there on the far right or the farthest east brought McNary into this response. So in those areas, there were carcass exportation restrictions for hunter-killed carcasses, and then also wildlife feeding restrictions. You refer back to Dr. Grove's presentation, how he shared the risk of concentrating animals or the increased CWD risk from concentrating animals, and that is why the wildlife feeding restrictions were put in place. And then the agency, in partnership with hunters, began an extensive monitoring effort in these counties. So where we had been doing statewide surveillance to try to detect the disease if it were to occur in Tennessee, we switched at that point for those 3 counties to monitoring, and we put as much effort as we possibly could into trying to determine how much disease was there and exactly where it was. And that, in order to allow for that to happen or enable it, was a new deer season or an extension of deer season in Fayette, Hardeman, and McNary counties this past January. And during that time, established drop-off locations and mandatory check stations where hunters could bring their deer to be, to be sampled. So they could bring deer to those locations, and we could get those samples. So that extended hunt season did 2 things. It increased the harvest, which is good for disease management purposes, but then it gave the agency more access to samples, which better informs our decision making and what management actions we take as we move forward. And it was a really good thing. It was a really good decision, and it was also a really good response from the hunters in those areas. So it's hard to tell how many people are here tonight that were at the public meeting in January in Bolivar. But for those that were there, you may remember that there was sort of a call to action where we asked, we communicated several things. We communicated that we're fully committed to this issue, and it is a very significant conservation issue. We realize that. We communicated that we feel a sense of loss as well. This is something that we're struggling with. And when I say struggling with it, I don't mean that we're struggling with what to do. We absolutely know what to do, and are doing the best job we can. It's just this is something we care deeply about, so we wrestle with that. But we also recognized and communicated there that we realize that best management of this disease is not possible without close partnership with the affected stakeholders, especially hunters, processors, taxidermists, and landowners in this area. And at that time, this is what we knew. We had, this is a map, and the red dots represent the positives that had been detected. And again, they had only at that time had been detected in Fayette and Hardeman counties. So we were looking at these 2 counties and the nearby counties with special interest. Well, very quickly, as a result of the new deer season and the cooperation that hunters showed and the support that they showed, this became a reality, and throughout those efforts, we determined that we detected chronic wasting disease in 186 deer, and a new county was found to be positive, so we then had 3 positive counties. And I'll also show you or point out that some of those positive locations are right on county borders. For example, Shelby County, there's a positive there right inside Fayette, and then we found another positive deer that had been harvested even closer to McNary County. And I want to just share with you that if you do an estimate of the affected area based on what we see here, 1.4 million acres. And that's just in Tennessee. So that's the way I describe this affected area. So it's a monumental challenge that we have. And I'll also point out that just south of Tennessee in Mississippi, they're also finding chronic wasting disease there. So I point out that just how large of an area this is to just kind of frame what kind of challenge it is, but then to re-emphasize how important it is for us to be in partnership, and it's going to require everybody's cooperation in order to best manage this. A few more details or results as a result of the extended hunting season and then the monitoring efforts that took place. Now these results, basically what you have here is you have the positive counties, the original two positive counties, Hardeman and Fayette. And that at the time that we were collecting this, those were the only positive counties we knew about. But we put special emphasis on sampling deer in the surrounding counties as well. And that's what you have here is the 8 counties where the monitoring efforts were conducted. And as I mentioned before, Madison County was found to be positive. But this is a really impressive effort, the fact that hunters provided the amount of samples that we were able to secure, and that the agency was successful in gathering this much information in cooperation with you, because this is the types of information that we need to decide how to best manage the disease. So as we move forward, the way that we're referring to this area, or the way that we're defining the area for regulation's sake, and then just for our management plan, is that the counties where we've found it to be already in are considered positive. In any county where it's been found to be within 10 miles but not yet detected there is considered high risk. And I want to caution you all that, you know, in the big scheme of things, we're very early in our management actions for CWD, and not trying to be negative, just trying to be completely upfront that there is a chance that some of these high-risk counties, the ones we're considering high risk where we have not found it yet, there is a chance that it is there, and if that's the case, we're likely to find it this fall, because we're again going to have an extensive effort to find out more about prevalence and spatial distribution. In other words, how much is there and where it is, and we're gonna hone in on this area again to get as good information as we possibly can in partnership with you all. And there is a chance that some of those counties will turn to red and will be considered moving forward. A few other little, well, they're not little, they're very significant. They're just fairly simple to communicate. Some of the other information that we gained from the deer that you've provided was prevalence. And I want to go through just at a very high level some of these things to share with you, because they're considerations when thinking about the hunting regulations that James is going to talk about next. And the things that he's going to share is just simply a concept for hunting regulations that we're considering internally, and we will soon develop an official proposal for our commission to consider. But this was some of the information used to develop that concept. So in Fayette, Hardeman, and Madison counties, you see the prevalence there. And I've really simplified this further than some of my colleagues may even be comfortable. But it's completely accurate information, and it's just summarized to help everybody to be able to understand it in the best way possible. So what you're looking at is averages here, and it looks to be about 11% in Fayette, and 7% in Hardeman, and 1% in Madison. And if you look at this, if you combine those counties and you look at the prevalence of males versus females, you see about a 7% prevalence in males, 7% in females and 12% males. And the take-home point on this is that your males are showing about twice as much chance of being positive than the females. Okay, so the prevalence is twice as high for males as it is for females, is what we're finding. And that's very important when you're doing disease management to consider.
Is that not age related?
I'll get to some of that now. And please hold your questions till the end. We'll be sure we cover all those. So the next thing I want to share with you is in regards to age class is, and this is specific to males, what we've found is that the adult males showing about a 15% prevalence, the yearlings 5%, and 1% for fawns. So the take home here is that your older age class males are the most likely to have the disease. And it's significant if you look at the difference between 5% and 15%. Moving on, we're looking at the prevalence of females, and you have about a 7% in the adult females, 8% in the yearlings, and 2% in fawns. And if you look at the details or you look at the full report on this, you'll see that there's really no difference. That 7 and 8% is the same. So you might as well say it's 7% for females, whether they're adults or yearlings. And when I talk about yearlings, I mean a year and a half deer, year old deer, and the adults would be above that. Did I say that right, James? Okay. All right. So moving on, those are all the results, and we certainly appreciate your guys' part in helping us have that information so that we can move forward in the best way possible. Some more ways that you can help us, and some of these are a reminder from earlier, but to continue hunting and help keep the hunting traditions alive. You're the most significant stakeholder involved in the management of this disease. Also, to honor the carcass importation restrictions that have been a regulation for years now in our state. And we encourage the use of synthetic deer and elk lures instead of natural ones because of the risk associated with bodily fluids from deer or elk. And then encourage reporting sick or abnormal acting deer or elk. Specific to where we are now as far as CWD positive in high-risk counties, we encourage that hunters harvest their bag limit and provide deer for sampling. And I'll remind you that opportunities for that are sampling drop-off locations and participating processors and taxidermists that can take a sample for you, and then check stations as advertised, which we plan to have this fall. And to abide by the wildlife feeding and carcass export restrictions that apply to these areas, and to follow best practices for carcass disposal. We recommend that you leave unused deer parts at the harvest location, and preferably those will be buried, and then other parts be bagged in landfill. And then another nice option is to use a meat processor for disposal. So those are the recommendations that we hope you can adopt in order to help best management. The next steps for TWRA is a continual development of our management plan, and I'll acknowledge that continued there, looks like I lost an ED there, ED at the end of that word, so pardon me for that. But continued development of our management plan, which includes the hunting regulations that we have a concept we'll share with you in just a few minutes. And then we're beginning an extensive communications effort or planning to help you be as informed as you can possibly be, and to learn from you so that we can move together in the best way possible, or move forward, excuse me, in the best way possible. And then begin some supportive research to measure the impacts of our management actions, and then also to better understand the best way to manage this as far as how it impacts you. And then also another initiative is to establish more testing opportunities, make things quicker, make things more convenient. Those are the type of things we're trying to accomplish. And then to continue our monitoring efforts in the affected area, and then continue surveillance outside those areas to be sure that we detect it if it were to occur in another area of the state. And then to continue listening to you. And we appreciate you guys again being here tonight. And want to want to follow up with you at the end of the meeting as much as you would like to. And I believe that's all I have, Joe, so I'll defer back to you.
Thank you, Chuck, and I'm so glad he put up there how you can continue to partner with us, and I think you'll feel that and hear that in a theme throughout all the speakers tonight. I did want to apologize and provide you with some information. I mentioned the commission meeting is coming up in April. I didn't have the dates handy. I do have them now. So April 25th and 26th is our commission meeting. It's in Paris, Tennessee at the Holly Fork Shooting Complex. So that'll be another place where we can communicate with you about the hunting regulations. So at this point, next up is James Kelly, our deer program leader, and he'll share some initial thoughts about the things that we're thinking about regarding harvest strategies for this fall in the positive and high-risk counties. So, James?
Thank you, Joe. Good evening, everyone. Excuse me while I get my PowerPoint loaded up here. Let's see here. There we go. As Joe mentioned, my name is James Kelly. I'm the Deer Management Program Leader with TWRA, and tonight I have the privilege of sharing what we're calling a concept at this point. It's something that we've been vetting internally and having a lot of discussions about, and we're ready to share that with you just to kind of get a feel for what you think as we prepare our recommendations to our commissioners, as Joe just described. We'll share what we're thinking with them in April, and then have an official proposal, like he said, in May. And so this is what you see tonight is subject to change, but again, we want to show, kind of show our hand as to where we're at, and we want to get your feedback. We want to know what you think. So before I dive into what we're thinking about right now, I want to share a little bit about what our objectives are. And on the left-hand side of the screen here, I'm going to show our fundamental objectives for managing CWD in Tennessee. First, we want to minimize the prevalence of CWD. And secondly, we want to maximize the containment of CWD. We don't want it to move. And kind of a sub-objective of that, or an enabling objective, that we need to identify the leading edge of the CWD outbreak. We think we're getting close, but we don't think we're quite there yet. And so that's kind of a short-term or more immediate objective, particularly this year. So those are our fundamental objectives. On the right-hand side here, I'm going to show you what we call means objectives, or important objectives to consider as we try to accomplish, those fundamental objectives. So we want to maximize stakeholder buy-in and participation now and into the future. And one of our major stakeholder groups is obviously hunters, but basically a stakeholder is anyone who significantly affects or is affected by deer or deer management. And so some enabling objectives of that objective are to maximize the simplicity of the regulations, or minimize complexity. We want to minimize conflicts with small game hunters, trappers, landowners, etc. Also, we want to maximize integration with the statewide deer plan. And we have a CWD goal within our statewide deer plan, which we just got finished completing, and I'm sure you've all been tracking with us on that and seen the e-blast about our deer plan. We have there's 5 goals, or 6 goals, in that plan, but 2 of the goals are decision-making and science goal, which are very relevant to how we manage CWD in Tennessee. So we want to maximize integration with that plan. So just to kind of build the suspense a little bit more, just a couple of things to keep in mind as we get into the concept. These counties are already in Unit L, meaning liberal, so the antlerless harvest is very liberal in these counties already. If I did my math right, you can harvest up to 330 antlerless deer in a season with an adult sportsman's license. So there's not much we can do on that end, the antlerless harvest. The regulations aren't limiting. So keep that in mind. Keep in mind why we extended it when we did the season last year, because we found CWD so late in the season. We expanded it to get that sampling opportunity to assess the situation, and we did, and you all did an outstanding job of getting us those samples, so thank you. And also the feeding and transport restrictions are part of this package. We won't cover that here because those are not subject to change. Those will be in place, and check out our website and we can discuss more about the details of those here momentarily, but that's part of the change for this year. This is only year one of a very long battle. We're going to be fighting this for decades, and this is the concept we're considering now. We think this is a pretty good package for year one. We think it's where we're at now. We think it could be effective, a small change, but could be very effective. And keep in mind that there is no silver bullet for CWD. There is no right answer. There's no cure. There's no known way to eradicate it. But given everything that we know, we think this is, again, what we're thinking at this point. So without further ado, what we're conceptually thinking right now are positive and high-risk counties would be the same as Unit L, and they would be Unit L with a few exceptions. And those exceptions would be in two areas, in the August buck hunt and then in the rest of the season. As you are all, I'm sure, aware, last year was the first year of an antlered only, archery only, private lands only hunt the last 3 days, the last Friday, Saturday, Sunday of August. The rest of the state, we're not proposing any changes for that hunt this year. We are proposing some, not proposing, again, concept, thinking about having some exceptions for that hunt in the positive and high-risk counties. So, and one of the exceptions would be to allow rifles during that hunt. So you could still use archery, muzzleloader, but so it would be the GMA, like you see in the hunting guide. Guns, muzzleloader, archery. 2 bucks, and they wouldn't be your statewide limit bucks. These would be 2 bucks that would not count against your statewide bag. Public land, it would be on public lands too, or on our wildlife management areas. So that's that part of it. That's the August buck hunt part of the concept. Now for the rest of the season, it would just be Unit L, except for if you get your deer tested and it comes back positive, that would be what we're calling a replacement buck. It would not count against your statewide bag limit of 2. We also, folks should plan on having mandatory check stations on select weekends. Which weekends those will be is to be determined. There's a lot of considerations that go into that, and we're having a lot of discussions internally about when those weekends will be. So stay tuned on that, but expect that there will be a few weekends in there of mandatory check. So that is the concept that we're considering. We've thrown around a lot of different things and considered a lot of different things, but we keep coming back to this as the concept at this point. Some benefits we see at this point, it's a small change, but it could potentially have a big impact on managing the disease. It's aligned with the BMPs, and that's an acronym that means Best Management Practices. There's a published document that experts from throughout North America, and we have one of the authors of that North American here, and Dr. Dan Grove, which you heard from earlier. The best management practices say to target older age class males because you saw that they're more likely to test positive, and to target them before the rut. So before those home ranges start to expand and before they start potentially contaminating the environment and spreading the disease. So what this concept is aligned with those best practices. We think it could be very popular, a special opportunity in this area. You know, we always know we can't please everybody all the time, but we think this could be a popular and very special opportunity. It fits within the current season framework, which we see as a benefit, especially that objective of minimizing complexity. It's just Unit L with some exceptions. And it keeps hunters hunting. If they can go hunting and if they shoot a positive buck and can get that buck replaced, it doesn't count against their bag, they can go back out and hunt again, and they're hunting right where we want them to remove those potentially positive deer off the landscape. And so, again, just to be transparent about what we're thinking, as we've been vetting this internally, some frequently asked questions and some anticipated questions from you all. I'll just kind of go through them. So why not increase the antlerless bag limit? As we discussed, the antlerless harvest is extremely liberal already. It could be a negligible gain in harvest that wouldn't be worth the added complexity. Again, we want to minimize complexity. And education and marketing will be key. And so this is my shameless plug. We want you all to harvest more antlerless deer. That's one way that you can help contain, to minimize prevalence and contain the disease. To shoot more antlerless harvest, not only this year, but again, a sustained effort into the future. So why not extend the hunting season again? We did that last year. We want to minimize conflicts with small game hunters, trappers, landowners, etc. And again, we want to reduce complexity. We want to keep it as aligned with the other seasons in the rest of the state as much as possible. Again, we extended it when we did because of when we found it. And essentially, we got a really good head start coming into this season. As far as sampling, we're confident that we can get all the samples that we need during the length of the regular season. So some have asked, why not increase the buck bag limit? Again, we want to keep complexity reduced, keep it aligned with the rest of the state, but that is something that we're willing to revisit in the future. But by not increasing it outright right now, this would allow us to increment over time. We can monitor the impacts of this concept. If that's something that gets proposed and then adopted, we could monitor those impacts and potentially add to it by increasing the buck bag limit over time in the positive and high-risk counties. So again, the thinking here would be see how the concept works and then increment. Someone internally said, so we're changing one weekend of hunting and that's it? Well, no, not really. There's also the feeding and transport restrictions, which are going to be new to a lot of hunters in this area. There's the replacement buck concept, and there will be mandatory check stations on those select weekends. And not shown here is obviously the marketing efforts and educational efforts to get folks to harvest more antlerless deer as well. But we do think that that 3-day August hunt will likely have the biggest additional impact. So why not allow antlerless harvest during the August hunt? We anticipate that there will be some unweaned fawns, and 2 months is about the age that fawns are weaned, and we don't want to, we wouldn't want to orphan unweaned fawns, and so because there's plenty of opportunity for antlerless harvest during the rest of the season, at this point we decided to leave that off the table. So what's the anticipated impact for this August rifle hunt or August buck hunt? Well, it's hard to predict, but during the opening of gun season in the 8 counties, in the positive and high-risk counties, there were 1,137 antlered males taken. Could we approach that level of harvest? With a little bit of cooperation from the weather and the opportunity for, to harvest a buck with velvet antlers, the 2 buck that don't count against your buck bag limit, allowing, modern firearms and public land availability, it should be a pretty big incentive for a lot of participation that we might not have had last year during that hunt and might not have on opening weekend of gun, just because it's, again, a very unique and special opportunity. What's the anticipated impact of replacement bucks? Another thing that's difficult to predict. However, there was about 15% of the bucks that were tested in Fayette and Hardeman came back positive, so that was about 100 animals that, if with this rule, those hunters would be able to go back, and that was just at the tail end of the season. So there could be a significant number of hunters going out and getting a replacement buck. So it's hard to predict, but it does keep hunters precisely where we need them to be hunting and harvesting deer where we want them to harvest deer. So that's us being transparent with kind of our thinking and where we're at this point, but we truly do want to know what you think. And so we want to hear your feedback. And then there's a little poll at surveymonkey.com/r/CWD and TN, as in Tennessee. And with that, I'll give it back over to Joe. Thank you.
Thanks, James. I just want to say thank you all for your patience and your quietness and your attentiveness. I know those chairs are hard. I had a cushion on my chair, so thank you for your patience. This next part is, I think, probably the part that you guys are really anxious for us to get to. Amy Snyder-Spencer is going to come and lead us in a question and answer session. If anybody has another question that you've thought of that's occurred to you that you haven't gotten with us, raise your hand and wave it. I think we've got some folks that can come get those questions for you. So Amy was recently an officer in Madison County. Many of you may know her from there, and she now serves in our Outreach and Communication Division here in Region 1, and she'll be leading the question and answer session. She's going to use a different mic.
I like to be.
I'll turn it up. Hold on.
Testing. You want to start off? Yeah, you're special. Dr. Grove likes to answer or ask his own questions and answer them himself.
There's usually a lot more questions for me, so it's just easier to do it this way. There's actually been a couple of questions regarding an announcement that was made in Pennsylvania with regards to bacteria, a spirochete bacteria, being the cause of prion disease. At this point in time, we have to work with the information that we have. That's an alternate theory to the prion theory. The prion theory was first demonstrated to be real back in the early 80s. The scientists who actually developed that theory won the Nobel Prize for it in 1997. Since the prion theory was first initiated and developed and proven time and time again, there's been over 18,000 research projects across the world regarding human disease, animal disease, and even plant and fungus prion diseases. Prions are a real thing. What the involvement of the spirochete bacteria that are in question, that's unknown at this point in time. The work that has been done with that has not been able to be reproduced, and they've not been able to produce prions as a result of infecting an animal with those bacteria. And so I just wanted to at least cover that because there was quite a few questions about that.
Okay, I'm going to jump in and go to James. When did CWD testing begin, and in what counties?
Yeah, we began statewide testing in 2002, and that was a statewide effort, and there was federal funding for CWD testing in 2002 and 2003, and so those were statewide efforts, but then federal funding went away, and there was still limited statewide testing after that, but it dropped off precipitously until about 2015 in response to finding it in Arkansas. We really ramped it up after that.
Okay. Chuck, please clarify what the recommendations are in regards to disposal and field dressing of deer.
Hopefully I covered that fairly well in the presentation, but it's, you know, in these areas that we know CWD exist is that we're recommending that hunters leave as much of the animal parts as possible on location, and those that may leave the location, that they bag and dispose of those in a landfill. And back to the previous advice as far as on location is if you leave the animal parts there, we're recommending burying those, realizing that that comes with challenges, but also just doing the best job we can with recommending the most sanitary way to dispose of animals.
Okay, Dr. Grove.
Have you found the source? The reality is, it's, at this point in time, we'll never find it. It's been out there on the landscape long enough to find an exact point source of it. It would be next to impossible. In terms of knowing that, it wouldn't really impact how we manage the disease, because all the methods to bring prions into the state, there's rules and regulations against them. Obviously, there's potential for illegal things that can occur, which is really hard to try and stop everything. The more important thing is what we're going to do from here and move forward. So the disease is here, it's not going away, and so we just have to be ready to deal with it.
Okay, James. Will we be going back, or will you be going back and contacting hunters that harvested CWD non-detected deer and plot them on a map also in the years to come?
That's something that we're talking about and considering. It would be advantageous to have that data, and that's one of the questions on the survey is we want to get a sense of your all's willingness to share that data with us, understanding that it may be, it's just a matter of privacy to you. So we want to get a sense of that, but that's testing. Okay, sorry. Yeah, if we can get that information from you all, that'd be helpful to us. And if there's the large majority is willing to share that, we want to set up a mechanism where everyone can volunteer that.
Okay, Chuck. Will CWD testing be funded by TWRA for the counties in the chronic wasting disease zone? And what about counties outside the zone?
That's a really good question, and I can only speak about next year because that's the way that we've got a plan for this. Realizing it's still new and we're in the process of developing long-term plans, including budgeting. But in the high risk and positive counties next year, we will be providing testing at no cost to the hunters. We're currently weighing the trade-offs of providing sampling opportunities across the state. So in other words, not only in the affected area, but outside that area as well. Whether or not we will do that at no cost is something we just don't know yet. We're trying to figure out what the logistics of that would be and what the cost would be. And then if there were costs that we could incur, is that something we could do long term? So that's a thing we're working on right now, and we've already started developing a plan for our leadership to consider as to whether or not we provide that service.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Grove.
How definitive is the testing for CWD, and how confident can I be with a negative result? First, it's a not detected result, meaning we're only looking at a very specific tissue. What we can tell you is the tissue that we're using early on in the infection is where it's going to be found first. That's why we use that tissue, because when we detect it as soon as possible, the likelihood of it actually being further in the body, if it's early in the detection, is not that great. So in terms of if it wasn't in the tissue that we used, it's a very, 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 very low risk that it's actually in the rest of the animal and it was just missed. Key thing is that we can never guarantee 100% one way or the other. With that, that also goes along with the slide that I threw up that had the different body sites that the disease can actually be found in. Again, remember, it's highest concentrations in your spinal cord and in your brain, as well as in the lymph nodes. And so if you're removing the lymph nodes whenever you're processing your meat and you're not cutting through the spinal cord, you're not potentially, you know, putting that into the meat that you're processing if the animal should be at a low grade that was missed. The reality is the test that we use is really, really sensitive and very, very specific. And so if it's there, you know, 99 times out of 100, you know, actually it's 99.9% of the time it's actually found. And there are tests, the way the test is run, there's a potential of what we call a weak positive, and those animals get resampled and we look at other tissue from that animal to guarantee whether it is or it isn't a positive animal. And so we use multiple tests to determine that. And so, you know, there's a pretty high level of confidence if you get that not detected that it wouldn't actually be in the meat that you're eating, because there's a really low prevalence of it in the meat as it is. And that kind of goes along with one of the other questions that we get. I've got meat in my freezer, can I get that tested? The tests that we have available to us today, they're not designed to actually test meat. It's designed to test the tissue that we're actually looking at. Since it is in such a low prevalence in the meat, they're actually very special tests that are used in research settings only, so it's not really a commercially available test that we have available for people at this point in time to provide them some level of additional confidence. And that's just the nature of where we're at with the disease, and that goes for any prion disease. Whether you're talking about mad cow, scrapie, or even human prion disease, there's not really those kind of tests to look at that other tissue that are commercially available.
Okay, James. If we need to thin the deer herd in the affected area, how soon can we start? I gave you some hard questions.
Yeah, that's a great question. You're going to be able to start when hunting season starts. That's the short answer is, yeah, the beginning of deer season.
Okay. Chuck, could a person send a sample to a lab to be tested?
Before I answer that, let me add on to what James shared there about the question on when can you harvest deer. What he said is absolutely true. The first opportunity for that would be August, because that's when the first season will be there, and that's regardless of whether or not the concept that we're considering is finally adopted, because that's when we anticipate the first season to be. Some other things that are considerations for the future, and they're things that, you know, just because of the newness of this, and there's just so many things to plan for beforehand, that hopefully you've seen the results of, is in the future, in areas, especially in positive counties, we anticipate there be a mechanism where landowners would partner with us, and that those landowners would have the ability to do some harvest outside of the traditional hunting regulations for disease management purposes. So just realize that those types of things, I think that question was getting at, are things that are being developed. So they may not currently exist, but they will. And your question was?
Okay. If feeding wildlife is banned in affected areas, why are retailers still selling feed?
Did the question change?
Did I give you another one?
Yeah, you did.
Oh, sorry.
But I'll answer that one though. The question was why are they still selling seed if it's illegal to feed wildlife in the affected area, and realizing there's some exceptions on feeding for agricultural purposes and food plots and bird feeding and that sort of thing. But the reason is because there are those exceptions, and because, you know, normal agricultural practices need to occur, and we don't want to hinder that in any way. And a lot of the seed that's being sold is for, say, feeding cattle or planting crops.
Could someone send a sample to a lab themselves?
Yeah,
that was the original question.
That's right. There are labs across the country that will receive hunter submissions. So that, yes, that can happen. However, I will encourage folks to read the details before they submit, because there's a lot of factors to consider before you try to do that. One is what type of sample do they accept? The cost, there's quite a bit of difference in cost depending on the lab. There's detailed instructions on how you ship those. There's just a lot of things there that you need to be familiar with before you choose that option. But yes, those options are out there.
Dr. Grove?
I'm going to answer a couple here. They're kind of related. What was man's role in the development of CWD? I'm assuming in terms of, there's multiple ways to kind of answer this and look at that question. If you looked at that map and the rate of spread that I showed, there's obviously man-assisted movement of the disease, whether it was in the live animal and moving live animals, or whether it was through moving infected carcasses that ended up on the landscape somewhere else, and then was a source of infection for other animals. If you want to go back to where the disease first developed, there are some theories as to where it probably came from. And if you look at it, you know, people always ask, well, has it always just been here and we're just now finding it? Based on the level of surveillance that was done after Wisconsin found their first positives in 2001, there was an intensive effort nationwide looking at sampling efforts, and basically every state was sampling like crazy because there was federal money available. The reality is there weren't positives found at that point in time. If it was kind of just ubiquitous in the environment, meaning it was just always there, just has always been there, we would have seen it prior to this. Even within Colorado and Wyoming, where they've gone back and looked at the disease, they've looked at historical samples of animals that were exhibiting similar clinical signs, and the prions weren't there. Most likely what it is similar to what happened with mad cow. It's a crossover event from another prion disease in another species. And it looks like, based on the research that's actually been done at this point in time, the most likely culprit for that is scrapie. They've actually taken scrapie prions, infected white-tailed deer with them and mule deer. On the other end of the animal, they took those prions that came out of those animals after they became clinical, infected them into new animals, and then the prions that came out of those animals were indistinguishable from CWD. So the most likely is that there was at some point in time a crossover event from most likely scrapie. Again, there's no way to ever prove it. And back to the original question, it's kind of hard to track that kind of stuff down, especially if it's been out there for years, and then to try and, it's not kind of like you see on CSI, the information doesn't come and flow within the course of an hour. So. One other good question, is there a database of legitimate studies on CWD we can access to review? There's too many opinions, blogs, et cetera, with no scientific data. If you go to the CWD Alliance website, they have a bibliography. If you go to the National Wildlife Health Center, that's run by USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey, that's based out of Madison, Wisconsin. There's bibliographies there also where a lot of them are you can click on it and pull up the article. The way I actually do my research for new diseases is I actually use PubMed, which is a medical, basically can find medical articles and things, and most of the CWD articles that are legitimate and have been peer-reviewed, meaning other scientists have reviewed the article before it gets published. That is another source, and that's just pubmed.org, and that's run by the NIH, the National Institute of Health. And so those are the three sources that you know, you can go to as a general public and have access to free online.
Okay, James. How is CWD and the attempt at control going to affect our deer depredation permits for summer crop control?
Yeah, that's a great question. You notice all these are great questions, and it's something, again, that we're actively discussing and deliberating over internally. At this point, the answer is we're not sure, but if I would like to say that if there are folks here that would like to give us feedback about that, and if there are folks who want to partner with us, especially in those high-risk counties or in Madison County, and would like to, you know, get us access to samples, we would be very interested in having those conversations. But at this point, it's unknown what that's going to look like from a regulatory standpoint.
Okay. Chuck, will processors hold deer until test results come back?
That would be a personal choice on behalf of the the processor. I hope I didn't oversimplify that, but it's just a choice of theirs to make. It's not ours to say. So I guess I'll just leave it at that.
We have several processor questions, so we're going to go over some more. Okay. Dr. Grove.
When do we expect a quick test for use prior to deer getting to the processors? In terms of right now, there's not like a development of an animal side test that's currently occurring. They've looked at trying to do that. The reality is the tests, the way they're set up, it's got to be in a controlled lab environment, and trying to take that to where you can do it animal side. There's cross-contamination issues and the way the test has to be run. Short version is what we're trying to look at and decrease is the length of time from the time when we get the sample until you can get your results. And those are the kind of things that, you know, there's only so much that we can do because there's just a natural lag period that's going to occur because we have to ship it out of state. So you automatically have a certain amount of time that it has to get there and then get the results back. If you look at I can't remember if James covered this already, but if you look at from the start of the season this year to the end of the season, it went from us getting it back in 3 to 4 weeks to at the very end it was 7 to 10 days. So we're already working with the lab that we're getting our samples done at to try and decrease that time period in between the sample collection and getting the results reported back out to you guys.
All right, James, are you going to mandate testing, and how will this be implemented?
There will be select weekends, as discussed in the concept, where it will be mandatory check, and there's a possibility that there could be different dates for mandatory check for those high-risk counties and Madison counties, basically all the counties that touch Fayette and Hardeman, because that's really the priority this year to identify that leading edge. You know, we know it's in Fayette and Hardeman County, and it's in most of Fayette and Hardeman County, and it's knocking on the door of these other counties from what we know right now. And we're working with statisticians and disease ecologists, and also with Dr. Grove here, and coming up with sampling targets, and we're talking with Region 1 staff about some of the logistical constraints about what days we could have those weekends. But outside of that, those weekends, it will not be mandatory, but we anticipate most of you will want to get your deer tested. So.
Okay, we're talking about time here. We're in a time constraint, so we're going to try to speed up some of these questions because we're running out of time.
But before you do, it's a nuance, but I want to be sure everybody understands. What James was describing was mandatory check-in, which is not the same as mandatory sampling, if you think about it. Some states have taken the action of mandatory sampling. We haven't taken that option. We decided to go with mandatory check-in, and while you're there, we've asked you to provide a sample, which most of the time that happens. So we're grateful for that, and we don't know in the future. You know, we may consider mandatory sampling eventually, but as of right now, it doesn't seem to be a need at this point.
Okay, Chuck, I hate to push y'all, but you know, will a hot zone be established and a kill-off be initiated?
A hot zone and a kill-off. I'm not even sure I understand the question. Are we going to take that type of drastic action as an agency? Absolutely not.
I think that's what we're looking for. All right, Dr. Grove.
This one's, again, related to kind of processing. How will CWD affect processors processing multiple deer with the same utensils? Is cross-contamination a concern? The reality is once the prion's outside of the animal, it doesn't reproduce. And so it would be surface contamination, if anything. And in general, it goes back to there's not very much prion actually in the meat. But there is enough prion to potentially infect another animal. But again, it goes back to the zoonotic potential. And those would be kind of things that if you want to have a conversation with your processor and have those conversations with them, how they handle in between each animal, because everybody does it a little bit differently. So.
Okay, James, any changes in the use of salt and feeders? And that's all I have, so I'm not sure
Yeah, I think, I don't know if you guys would rather address this. I guess if there's anything that I leave out, please chime in. I think James deferred to me because there's more law enforcement here to, law enforcement experience to defer to. And the question, as I understood it, Amy, was are there changes to feeders?
Or are there going to be any changes to the feeding? I guess the feeding ban is what.
Yeah, I don't anticipate any changes to the wildlife feeding restriction in high risk or positive counties.
Okay. Dr. Grove?
We're not seeing the numbers of deer that we should be seeing. Do you think the disease could be farther ahead of us than TWRA thought at the December meeting? Keep in mind, remember that little part where I talked about there's other diseases that mimic CWD, and one of those that will actually eliminate a lot of deer pretty quickly from the landscape is hemorrhagic disease, and that's one that you might have heard about before, also called blue tongue or epizootic hemorrhagic disease, EHD. This area that we're talking about has also had die-offs from that, and that is one where you see the multiple dead deer around a watering hole kind of deal. That's one that will drop your population right away. If you've got both diseases on the landscape interacting with each other, you're more likely to see effects of both diseases at the same time. The reality with chronic wasting disease is that the prevalence that we've determined in basically the distribution on the landscape as well as the number of deer on the landscape, we're probably not going to see population level effects as a result of the disease for quite a few years at this point in time. And that's just based on other states that have the same makeup of their deer, the same quality habitat, and things like that available for the deer. It's taken longer before they start seeing some of those shift in age structure. And so right now we're looking at 1 in 10. If you look at Wisconsin, they're over 50% prevalence in their adult bucks and 30 to 40% prevalence in their adult does. And they have not seen a drop in their population yet. But what they have seen is a shift in the age structure. That shift that I was mentioning before, they're not seeing animals greater than 4 years of age anymore. You don't see that 5 and 6 year old buck. You don't see that older doe, that 7, 8 year old doe that's had lots and lots of fawns. Usually you're going to see 2 to 3 year olds as primarily as long, when you get those higher prevalences, because they're just getting infected whenever they're young animals, which was another one of the questions that I didn't get a chance to get to at this point in time, is that they can be infected as soon as they're born if the mom is infected, just through the natural process of birthing, as well as potentially through the milk and through her cleaning up the animal because it's shed in her saliva. So.
Okay, James, is TWRA going to ask hunters for input on the proposed regulations?
Yes. Survey, what is it? surveymonkey.com/r/CWD and TN.
I'm impressed that you've got it all.
Yes, absolutely. That was an easy one. Yes, and then there'll be a proposal in April where they attend the commission meeting?
Or we take recommendations in April, like we're doing right now for the fishing regulations.
Oh, right.
You'll email your comments and recommendations.
Yeah, so there'll be, opportunities here tonight, and then there'll be more opportunities as we go along. So, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Chuck, if I take a deer to be processed and the deer tests positive, again, who pays for the processing and who is regulating the processors? Who's going to be enforcing the new restrictions on the processors? I'm going to try to condense some here.
I'm not aware of restrictions on processors.
Well, like we have people that want to know about, will they be cleaning the utensils and things like that?
Oh, okay. Well, the regulatory authority for meat processors is primarily the Tennessee Department of Agriculture. There is a health component where I believe the health department is involved in some regulating as well. So that's a little outside of or well outside TWRA's purview. As far as who will pay, there's no anticipated change in regards to processors as far as a hunter taking their animals there and getting them processed and then being responsible for that fee. So no anticipation.
It's a contract between the hunter and the processor.
Right.
Okay. Okay.
As part of the effort, once we found CWD, the Department of Agriculture did provide recommendations as to how to handle equipment and things like that if they're working in an area that there is CWD. So the processors have been provided with those recommendations. And those are kind of your standard basic sanitary processes and things. It's just using a little bit different chemicals than they might normally use.
Okay. Yeah.
Just to clarify, I feel like maybe that question was getting at the carcass export restrictions, and I don't know if we've clarified that yet. There are new carcass movement restrictions for positive and high-risk counties. These were established a couple months ago, but they will be in play this hunting season. So in positive counties, the carcass has to meet the restrictions before it can be moved out of the positive counties. So positive counties being Fayette, Hardeman, and Madison. So if I harvest a deer in Hardeman County, I can't take that deer that whole carcass to a processor in McNairy County, if I'm getting my geography right. I could go to Madison County, a processor in Madison County, but I have to go through, I can't go outside, I can't go through a high-risk county into Madison. I would have to go through that narrow window where you're only going through positive counties. Same thing with with high-risk counties, you can move among high-risk counties as long as they're contiguous. And we'll have a map that shows this. Once you have a map, it's pretty simple. Explaining it without a map makes it somewhat complex. But you could move a carcass, say, from Shelby, say you shoot a deer in Shelby County, which is a high-risk county, you could bring that whole carcass into Fayette County, because where the risk is if it's going out. So you could bring that carcass in and say your processor was in Fayette County, but if you shot it in Fayette and your processor was in Shelby, that wouldn't work. Does that make sense? Kind of?
And we do have some maps out on the way out. It's kind of got some blue on it, and it will show you the high-risk county. It will show you the positive counties, so you can look at that. If you're not sure, you can look at that on your way out. Dr. Grove?
There's some of these questions that might not have been clear whenever I was giving my presentation. There has been talk, multiple levels of vaccines. I mentioned a few that there's actually been studies done on and published. There's not a viable vaccine at this point in time. Going back to the very first question I answered in this Q&A session regarding the spiroplasma bacteria, one of the claims that they made when they were making that announcement was that in a year to 2 years there will be a cure or a preventative method for CWD. We've got to move forward. That research hasn't been done. When it comes out there, we're going to let you know. We hope that there's something, that comes out in the future, but at this point in time, there isn't a viable treatment or vaccine for the disease.
Okay, James. If a landowner receives trail camera pictures or videos of a possibly infected animal, is there an address or email to send it to for analysis or tracking purposes?
Dan, what's your email again?
That was pretty good.
Yeah, if you're curious about it, yeah, just send it to, is it the Ask TWRA? Is it asktwra@tn.gov? If there's any question at all, just send it there and we can get an answer to you.
Okay. Chuck, we're going to go back to some of the feeding questions. Okay, why is there a feeding ban in the zone? And we kind of had this earlier. What about the exemptions for bird feeding, dove fields, ag practices, and can we plant food plots? Kind of all in one. I'm trying to combine some here.
What was the first part? Why is there a restriction? Why is there a restriction on wildlife feeding in the affected area? Again, just to keep from concentrating the animals as much as we can, because the more you concentrate them, the more likely they are to spread disease.
Okay, and then what about the exemptions for bird feeding, dove fields, ag practices, and can we plant food plots?
Yeah, so those exemptions are meant to allow, feeding that doesn't have a high likelihood of causing greater risk of disease transmission. That's, we don't want to prohibit, we don't want to be overly restrictive, but we do want to put in restrictions that support our, or support the best management of CWD. And as far, regarding food plots, having the food plots will not be illegal. I would recommend, however, that the larger the food plot, the better, because that would decrease the animals, or that would, what am I trying to say? Yeah. Here you go, Dan.
Basically, it's the same concept. If you have a bait pile, it's a very small area, right? But if you have a food plot where it's spread out, two things are occurring. The animals aren't going to the same spot in the food plot necessarily. Once that animal's eaten that portion of it, it's not there and available for another animal to come and eat. But if you're putting out a bait pile and you every week add more bait to that pile, basically those animals are coming back to that same spot. They're urinating and defecating while they're there. If you're going to do a food plot and you make it over a bigger area, you're less likely to concentrate those animals in a single spot. And what I actually kind of recommend is a long, thin strip along the edge of a wood line, because that keeps them spread out if you're going to go with those practices. If you just do like a little quarter-acre plot and that's all you have, all those animals are going to come into that 1/4 acre plot, and you're actually going to be concentrating them in a more refined area. And that's the key thing is like, since the prions are permanent in the environment, the more you put in a given spot, the more likely that is going to be a perpetual source of infection into the future.
Yeah, and Amy, please forgive me for this, but I'd like to go back to an earlier question. I struggled to really understand the question about will there be a hot zone and all the deer be eliminated. I'm trying to look at that from several different perspectives so that I hopefully answer it best. And I'll take another stab at it, and I'll say that is there, one interpretation might be, is there going to be a government takeover and the Wildlife Agency comes in and wipes out all the deer, and that's not going to happen. There are some special cases where if it makes sense from a disease management, if it just makes sense for the big picture as far as disease management, we may partner with landowners on occasion and work with them to reduce the deer population there to a level that it helps contain the disease and decrease prevalence. So I just wanted to go back and say that there may be times when we work with you individually as landowners to develop kind of a site-specific harvest strategy to help with disease monitoring and management efforts.
Okay, James. What is the confidence level of it not being there for this past season for the border counties, Haywood, Tipton, Shelby, McNairy?
That's a great question. I don't have those. We do have those, but I don't have those.
Numbers in.
Right, yeah, I don't have those off the top of my head. But that's a great question, and we can share those. I don't know what the best way to get those, but to the person who asked. But we do have those, and that's what we're looking at as we develop our targets for this year. So.
Well, we've got another one that is also, are the prevalence rates skewed because of harvest?
Are the prevalence rates skewed because of harvest? No. Well, they're because, if you can assume relatively even distribution of harvest throughout the county, and the diseases come throughout the, we've got positives all throughout the county. Now, the prevalence, the countywide prevalence for Fayette and Hardeman is not skewed, and we have really good confidence around those estimates.
Okay, all right. Chuck.
Let me add on to that. To kind of get at the earlier question that you had asked of James about the confidence in that, is it there or is it not there? There was the weighted-based surveillance plan in place, and correct me if I'm wrong, James, we met all those sampling goals for this year. That doesn't mean that the disease doesn't necessarily exist at a lower prevalence than what the scheme was set up to be detected at, and that was at 1% prevalence if it existed. Is that correct in those counties? 0.1%, sorry, 0.1, my decimal was off. So it could exist at less than 0.1% in those other counties, but it kind of goes back to what Chuck touched on. That's why we want to look at those counties more intensively and make sure that it isn't there, and if it is there in those buffering counties, that we get on it sooner rather than later.
Okay, Chuck, back to you. Granted, testing is expensive, but why wasn't more aggressive measures taken to test in the border counties? Likewise, why wasn't the information about testing drop-off locations distributed via mail, email, etc.?
Those are pretty difficult questions there. You know, the agency had a very quick response. I feel like looking back, and I'm real proud of how the agency responded. And you know, those things that are being referenced there, the availability of sampling, and then getting those results in a timely manner. We did the absolute best job we can, and I don't look back at that with any regret, but I'm also interested in always trying to improve those things for the future.
Okay. Dr. Grove, do you have any more? I'm sure you do.
There's a lot of overlapping ones.
Okay.
This might be one to close it out.
I've got 3 more.
Okay.
Do you have one?
These kind of go hand in hand, and I think we've touched on them again, but I want to just kind of hit it a little bit more. Given the number found in the area, how long do you believe that the disease has been prevalent in the area? It's almost impossible to say. We know it's been there for greater than a year. What the top end of that is, you know, it's really hard to estimate without having tons and tons of data from previous years. Along those lines, on the opposite end of the time scale, what is the future of white-tailed deer in 10 years in the state of Tennessee? A lot of that depends on assistance from you guys, as well as collaborative efforts to prevent the spread of the disease and to try and maintain the prevalence that it's at. If we look at other states where the disease has been for a long time, we kind of have an idea of what might happen if we don't get a hold of it sooner rather than later. In terms of being able to predict where we're at 10 years from now, it'd be next to impossible, and it'd just be a stab in the dark because we are so early on in this process of trying to come up with solutions for this. And so we just, you know, encourage continued support of the programs and continued feedback, positive or negative, you know, because both ways we got to learn as we go through this. So.
Okay, James, will there be any mandatory CWD check stations in the high-risk counties?
Yes, at this point we anticipate that will be the case as we've already discussed, and yeah, those high risk and Madison counties are going to be the priority this year, so definitely anticipate some mandatory check stations there.
Okay, Chuck, how should processors dispose of the deer?
Well, I would recommend the same best practices primarily, but I think the best case scenario for a processor is a landfill, and most of them use that service already. So, in realizing that that not all landfills are created the same, and I believe, double check me on this, but a Class 3 landfill is the one that is most would be best for disease management.
Okay, our last question, and it goes to James. Will our management plans be integrated with the North Mississippi, with Mississippi's plans?
Well, as much as possible. Their objectives in regards to CWD are the same as our objectives, but they have a very different hunting season structure. So they are working on making some changes right now, and their objectives are the same, and we're working hand in hand. They're working on liberalizing their antlerless harvest and reducing their buck age structure in certain parts of the state. So their management changes, reg changes are going to look different, but they're going to be, again, they're moving towards the same objectives, and we're working very closely with them.
Well, thank you, panelists, and thank you, audience, for submitting your questions. Let's give them a round of applause. So we've got to wrap up and honor our commitment to get out of here close to 9 o'clock. We dragged it out a little bit more because you guys had such great questions. But I want to thank the Fayette Academy for allowing us to spend the evening here with you. Just want to remind you or remind ourselves or say it out loud, each of you here tonight, both in person and those of you that are online, you're critical in our battle against chronic wasting disease, and you're a key partner in this. Processors, landowners, hunters, and taxidermists. Chuck provided an invitation to you to continue to partner next year, and so this coming year, rather. And so we welcome you to do that. Maybe three short things here. A smaller group of our staff are going to be working with the extension officers in the surrounding counties to hold some smaller scale public meetings in conjunction with the extension meetings that are typically held maybe on a monthly basis. So look for information on that if you want to come visit us again at a public meeting. Sign up. When Dr. Grove gave his presentation, he shared, we have a website, CWDintennessee.com. And on there, you can sign up for the weekly emails that we send out. If you haven't done that, go to that website. We'd love to connect with you there. And then also a reminder to follow up with the survey after the meeting. This will be up for a week or so we'd love to get your feedback. And finally, Amy and her staff offered to take comments as you leave. If there's something that's burning and you don't want to have to go log on to the SurveyMonkey at this hour of the night, you can write that comment down and we'll capture that at the end. So again, thank you for the partnership last year. Look forward to our partnership this fall, and thank you for coming out tonight. Appreciate it.